As we were preparing to launch this show to talk about whether there's going to be potentially war between NATO and Russia going forward, and lots of information on that front to talk about, but just before we were set to go live, we actually have some breaking news out of Moscow. And I want to bring in our guest just right away here. This is retired Commodore Steve Jermy from the UK. We've had on a number of times, one of our favorite guests. Really glad to have you on the show, Steve. But listen, I want to jump right to this because, we've been talking about what happened with the attack on the show here in the recent days by the Ukraine side deep into Russia, attacks on their railroad systems, attacks on the Crimea Bridge a couple of days ago. And then in light of this negotiations, which was more a dance and a farce than any kind of actual diplomacy in Istanbul a couple of days ago, this morning, and this video just surfaced just moments ago, we had Vladimir Putin giving his view of Volodymyr Zelensky.
Вспомним, еще совсем недавно украинские власти и их союзники грезили о стратегическом поражении России на поле боя. Сегодня на фоне огромных потерь, отступая по всей линии боевого соприкосновения, пытаясь запугать Россию, киевская верхушка перешла к организации террористических актов. И в то же время просят приостановить боевые действия на 30
And by the way, notice the angry look on his face. Very unusual for
на
Putin.
высшем уровне. Но как же проводить в этих условиях подобные встречи? О чем говорить? Кто вообще ведет переговоры с теми, кто делает ставку на террор, с террористами? И за что их поощрять, предоставляя передышку в боевых действиях, которая будет использована для накачки режима западным оружием, для продолжения насильственной мобилизации и подготовки других террористических актов, подобных тем, которые были осуществлены в Брянской или Курской областях.
So that's pretty strong. He's like saying, hey, this is like a terrorist regime. We can't even talk to terrorists. I just want you, because obviously we're springing this on you right now, Steve. What is your response to or your observation of that comment coming in light of everything that's happened recently?
I can't say I'm surprised, Danny. The events, the attacks were. Let's hope that the West were not involved in those. I suspect that they probably are listening to Larry Johnson, who I follow when it comes to intelligence matters. But they were strategically appallingly risky, and I'm astonished that if they were in the West, or perhaps Britain and America were in some way sanctioned them, that they were about as risky as you can imagine, even worse than firing Storm Shadows, etc., into Russia. I'm not entirely surprised by Russia's response. In fact, I'm not at all surprised. What will be interesting, though, to see is how this actually plays out, because there are a number of ways in which the Russians could respond. And it seems to me that risking as they did, although Putin didn't talk about it, risking as they did nuclear escalation, which is clear risk, and it's an appalling thing to do if MI5 and or CIA were behind it. But there's an appalling failure in strategic thinking and strategic judgment. But I think it also feels to me like it's changed the dynamics. I think, as you say, Putin looked angry to me. I don't blame him. I would be in his circumstance. He's trying to actually bring the negotiations to what you would call an ugly answer. But the options that Zelensky's got is uglier and really ugly. And at the moment, in my view, he should take the terms that he's been offered. And if I were in the West, I'd be advising him so to do. But for me, it's I think we had a debate about 6 months ago when we were throwing Storm Shadows and ATACMS into Russia. And I thought that at the time was strategically risky. And again, I said, and we both agreed that it would have no effect on the military campaign, and nor will this. So what's the objective? What's the purpose of these attacks, other than to follow the political narrative, the disorganized political narrative that the West seem to be used to guide their operations?
And yeah, you know what, I want to go down that path about the media circus that's going on with this, or the narrative, as you call it, because it is still in full force. We were actually going to lead with a video from yesterday from Volodymyr Zelensky, and one wonders, as you watch this video that's we're about to show here, if that's not part of what pushed Putin over the edge when he's talking about this regime. Watch this.
Чітка налаштованість Росії на війну, і вони цю свою налаштованість доводять і ударами, і своїми заявами. Все це аргументи, щоб були нові санкції проти Росії, жорсткі санкції. Я хочу подякувати всім американцям, всім європейцям, які підтримують такий шлях примусу Росії до миру. Це надзвичайно важливо. Путін не змінює свою поведінку, коли не боїться наслідків своїх дій. Росія має відчувати, що таке війна. Росія має нести збитки від війни. Вони повинні реально відчути, що продовження війни матиме для них руйнівні наслідки.
You know, interesting. First of all, by the way, if you guys like this kind of analysis and stuff that you're just not getting on many other channels or TV news, please like and subscribe. Really helps us out. But, you know, I find it, Steve, really rich and in a very negative way when he starts off his comments there saying that the actions of the Russians prove that they don't want peace, that they only want more, when it's the Ukraine side that has been blowing up civilian trains and railroad bridges in southern Russia, been making this attack on the strategic bomber force deep inside of Russia also. And of course, they've been firing drones back and forth between Moscow and Kiev. That's been going on for quite some time now. So it's a pretty substantial air campaign on both sides. And then, of course, this attack on the Crimean Bridge yesterday, or an attempt to bring it down. Apparently that didn't succeed. But I mean, you're doing everything you can to sabotage peace. And of course, then they go to the Istanbul meeting there. And the first thing that they do is put on the table something that they know for sure that Russia will categorically reject, which is starting off with an unconditional 30-day ceasefire. And so everything that the West and the Ukraine side is doing seems to be doing everything to make sure that Russia doesn't have a negotiated settlement under any terms. I mean, how do you see that dynamic playing out?
Well, I think it's going to play out on the battlefield, Danny, and Russia will win. So the question really is how the West comes to terms with that. I don't think the West realizes this yet at the moment, or certainly not at the senior political levels. At the military, I suspect they probably do if they've got any competence whatsoever. But the thing that struck me about what Zelensky said, he said Russia must feel the real consequences of the war. I mean, he honestly doesn't know what he's thinking about, because I don't think Russia has taken the gloves off yet. And if Russia wants to take the gloves off with the capacities it's got, like Urezhnek's missiles and so on, then Ukraine certainly will feel the consequence of the war. So the people to worry about feeling the consequence of the war are the Ukrainians and the Zelensky government. But I would also worry on behalf of the Europeans as well, because if the Europeans keep in a bellicose way trying to keep this war going, then I would not assume that the war will be confined to the Ukrainian campaign area. I could well imagine it extending beyond, and Russia starting to respond against, for example, a British factory that's going to produce 100,000 drones. Well, yeah, why wouldn't Russia do it? And what would the UK do in response? And the only response that we would have, because we can't defend against that attack, would be nuclear weapons, which would be suicide.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I want to shift his direction here, because obviously the center and the core issue is what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, but you can't talk about that unless you look at the broader lens about what's going on with the West behind Ukraine against Russia. And yesterday, I think it was yesterday, there was a news report that Mark Rutte, who'd been meeting with a number of European leaders, said that, oh, hey, kind of by the way, we're going to go ahead and invite Zelensky to the next NATO summit in The Hague shortly. That's coming up here. And one has to wonder, why in the world would you invite Volodymyr Zelensky now, especially when obviously the Russian side in their 12-point memorandum that they sent, their term sheet to Istanbul on Monday, which I think the most charitable way you can put it is it's a surrender sheet, because that's what it would require the Ukraine side to do. Let's be blunt about that. But then, that's the 12-point piece there. But now then, one of the clear requirements of the Ukraine side is that no NATO. They can't have any kind of Western military alignment or anything else. They also have a demilitarization. That's part of their requirements. And then President Trump himself has said that's not on the table. NATO for Ukraine isn't even on our table, and we kind of have some veto power there, along with every other NATO player. But then the question is going to be, why make a provocative move like this? What is the play on the Western side here?
It's very difficult to say. I can't even think of a sort of perverse reason. It must be a perverse reason to do it. But I guess it's a show of support from the NATO nations, Danny. But the problem is that NATO is going to lose. You and I know this. I wrote an article, I think it was about 6 months ago, in which I said NATO is a paper tiger. We're starting to talk about increasing defence spending, but the Brits are going up by 0.2%, 0.25 it might be. That's not going to make a difference. We were spending 6% of our GDP during the height of the Cold War, so that's not going to make a difference. We're talking about having the capacity within five years. I mean, it's too late. I'd be interested to see what you think, but I'd be surprised if the Ukrainians can last for another 6 months. Certainly, we're seeing across the campaign, across the fronts, what looked to me to be very thin defences, which are falling away as people like us have predicted. So I don't know what NATO's intent is on inviting Zelensky, especially as Trump has told Zelensky that Ukraine won't join NATO. And I think actually, if I were in Ukraine's situation, let's imagine there's a follow-on president to Zelensky. I don't know, it might be somebody like Klitschko, for example, who seems to be falling out with Zelensky in Kiev. And probably the last thing I want to do is join NATO. I mean, what good does it do to me? I've got a relatively weak paper tiger where I've got some noisy but small Baltic states, some rather bellicose but not much stronger Western European states, and America, which wants to walk away from NATO. So what's the point? I might as well be neutral and actually have a much better chance of security, because the Russians won't be quite so worried about me if I've declared to an Austrian type of neutrality.
To your question there a second ago, we actually had Doug McGregor on earlier this week, and he made a comment that, based on his research and study of the war fighting, et cetera, and he's actually published a book on this exact topic, is that he said it's going to take you a good decade to be able to retool and rebuild an armed force to be able to have a specific kind of fight above wherever we're at right now. And we don't seem to have a decade, and history proves that out. But the idea that we're just going to somehow retool, and then in a handful of years, as we're going to see in a minute, some in NATO are saying in a short period of time, somehow they want to be ready. But let's take a look, first of all, at what Mark Rutte said, because he made a couple of statements 2 days ago at some meetings that he was having that bear very much on this. The first one here, he's talking about how NATO has to be ready to fight.
We are facing the most dangerous security environment in decades. Russia's war of aggression continues. Terrorist threats persist. We are not at war, but we are not at peace either. So we must continue to strengthen our deterrence and defense. And that means pivoting towards a full warfighting readiness.
We have to have this full warfighting readiness. It somewhat, actually a lot, troubles me that he's saying we're not at war, but we're not at peace either. And everything is trying to be building up. And of course, you can't have anything doesn't happen in isolation. And when he starts off his comments there that we have continued Russian aggression, i.e. they started all this, they're completely at the wrong, and all we can do is respond to it. What do you say about that part, first of all?
Sounds to me like Rutte, surprisingly, as a former Prime Minister of Holland, wasn't taught history at school, because the history of this conflict goes back not only, of course, from February and March of 22 and through the Maidan Revolution, all the way back to the end of the Cold War. And time and again, we've been we've been warned by some very clever Western strategists, and of course Russia, that the taking Ukraine and Georgia into NATO would constitute a red line. And people say the Russians don't, they bluff. Well, they didn't bluff at all. They've been telling us for ages. And when we actually did it, finally, the war transpired. We weren't prepared for it. And the other thing is that actually, if we start talking about war fighting, the level of casualties that we're starting to hear, I think Doug McGregor saying 1.4 million. I listened to that interview, Danny. I thought it was a really good one between the two of you. He started to talk about 1.4 million plus 1.5. And the thing that particularly struck me, I can't remember if it was that interview, but was the 2 to 3 days where bodies would be taken away from the contact zone. And the thing that struck me particularly was the people talking about the stench on the Ukrainian side because of the numbers of bodies. This is the real truth of this thing. And I just find it incredibly cynical that all of the European leaders can actually want to keep this fight going when it's clear to anybody who understands the balance of power that we're going to lose, and that by keeping it going, then we were committing more and more Ukrainian men and indeed women to their deaths for a fight which we're continuing for a war that we've actually created by marching NATO up to Russia's borders in the first place. I mean, it's hypocrisy beyond hypocrisy.
And, we had a soundbite of General Ben Hodges, U.S. retired general, just a few days ago. I think it was the end of last week, was emphatically saying, yeah, Ukraine has a manpower issue. They need to keep pushing back harder on Russia. But hey, we could just keep bringing in more men and women, and let's put them in the mix too. And I think altogether we can get that. And I was just shocked by that, even by his standards, to now start throwing women into the mix of, yeah, let's just grab all these women off the street too and throw them into this meat grinder of a senseless and losing battle. But there's no concept in there about the cost. I'd like to send General Hodges to that battlefield just to breathe for a period of time, look at the carnage, and then go back again and look at those women in Ukraine and then tell them, yeah, why don't you go join that crew? Let's see how effective that turns out to be. But I don't know. That's just where it is. But I'm with you on the moral indignation of it.
Yeah. No, I mean, we perhaps we should have a platoon created of former Western generals who feel strongly about this. Let's send them off and see if they want to get back into uniform and fight it. I mean, it's worth remembering as well, because there is this general sense that the military and the senior military always know what they're talking about. It's probably just worth remembering that actually we have very few generals. In fact, I'm not sure that we will have any who, other than those who were in 2003 in Iraq, who have actually fought a major war where you've got a peer-to-peer opponent. Indeed, even Iraq wasn't a peer-to-peer opponent, but Iraq was the last time in 2003 against a bit of a ragtag Iraqi army that actually the West won. So how many generals have we got who've actually been in a position where they've had success on the battlefield? So the people that we're listening to haven't got success on the battlefield. I mean, I think the problem as well is that no matter how good you are operationally, if you can't think and act strategically, then I'm sorry, but you shouldn't actually have 3 or 4 stars on your shoulder.
Yeah, and if you can't think and act strategically or fight effectively tactically, the worst of all possible worlds. And I think that's where we are on this.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at in my book, when you look at the great strategists and the great strategic leaders, Danny, the thing that's most striking about them is that they are exceptional operational commanders, but also they're very clever and they're very creative as well. And they're very thoughtful. And if you take people like Moltke the Elder, like Frederick the Great, Slim was probably the best British general who defeated the Japanese in Burma. They're incredibly creative and interesting people who are thoughtful, and they're not just likely to be on a tram line which says this is how we do stuff. They think about things in a different way, and in a very interesting way. I see some of that in Putin. I mean, I listened to Oliver Stone's interviews, his 4 interviews with Putin, almost at the start of the war, and I listened and I read as well Philip Short's biography. And he is an extremely bright and extremely interesting man who thinks strategically and is able to hold his nerve strategically. Whereas we've got a bunch of leaders in the West, actually, who are following, a bit like the Keystone Cops, the political narrative, which has taken them all over the place, except to victory.
And and here's part of the compounding problem is that you have these Keystone cops trying to go down a path here, and they unfortunately have control of the purse strings.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, NATO, as Ruta continues on here, is ready to put their money where their mouth is.
I can assure you this old 2% we agreed in 2014 is not nearly enough to reach all the capability targets we need to reach, to fill all the gaps we have in our defense system. We can defend ourselves now against Russia, but we can't in 3 to 5 to 7 years. We have seen yesterday the comments by the Chief of Defense of Germany, and clearly we have to stand ready. So it will be considerably more than the 2% we were used to. And we also have to acknowledge that next to the hard defense spending, there is the issue of all the defense-related spending, including military mobility, including are our societies ready, including building up the defense industrial base.
Yeah, he mentioned the defense chief for Germany, Breuer, which I'm going to talk about here in a second. But let's start off with some of the contentions that he's making here now, which is that you have to be expanding the NATO capabilities. We have to have more infrastructure. We have to have more troops. And then we have to have way more than 2% of GDP, he said in that. And first of all, I want to look at it from a couple of different perspectives on those issues there. First of all, does Europe have the money to punch up way above 2%?
I don't think it has. I mean, when he says we're going to spend more money, what he actually means is we're going to spend more debt. I mean, even so we're spending from the future. This is a weight that we're putting on our children and our grandchildren. So the short answer is no. But if you recall, I did an article on the balance of power and the foundations of that. Two key elements of the balance of power. The first is industrial capacity, and the second is energy. Europe is desperately short of energy. We've actually increased our energy imports from Russia recently. So, so much for the sanctions. And the second thing is that we don't have the industrial capacity at the moment. Indeed, I think that's a super big problem for America as well, because your interest in reindustrialization. It's taken us 20 years or 30 years to send all our, thanks to the Chicago School of Economists, to send all our industrial capacity abroad, off to China, amongst other places. And the idea that we can sort of recreate this, I mean, I think Doug's probably right. A decade seems about as early as we could get to a significant amount of capacity. But
let's just take another aspect of the people within Europe, whether it's in Great Britain where you live or in some of these other countries. Are they going to be willing to have their governments divert funds or put more debt load on top of them in order to send it over here, as opposed to any place domestically or increase spending anywhere else, where I think there's already lots of unhappiness and angst throughout Europe about that their governments aren't taking enough attention of their people? How do you see that playing out?
I think it can play out in two ways, Danny. I mean, and I think probably two interrelated ways. The first thing is that because there is I wouldn't say there's a blanket, but there is a complete stovepiping in the way people think about the war in Europe. And that's largely speaking due to a mainstream media which self-censors itself. I mean, I've written for the Times before, not in the slightest bit interested in any alternative view on the war, notwithstanding the logic of the case. So because of that, you've got a European populace who, I wouldn't say that everybody, and there are certainly a lot of people, as you read through the comments to your and my podcast, who are relieved to actually hear people talking what they see to be common sense. So I think those people will, for the moment, probably say, okay, well, we probably do need to spend more on defense. But that's until the rubber hits the road. Then when the rubber hits the road and suddenly health budgets have been cut back, and prison budgets have been cut back, and schools budgets have been cut back, and arts budgets have been cut back, then I think people will start to think differently. So that's the first bit of it. The second bit of it is, as it becomes increasingly clear that Ukraine is going to lose, and that all we're doing is throwing good money after bad, I think those two things will come together. and create what I could imagine will soon be not a political storm, but a political squall. But it could lead to a political storm if the European leaders keep on going, despite the fact
Now,
that the war is
what if,
obviously
let's say
lost.
that starts happening and the Ukraine starts demonstrably losing, so that it's not just, a village or two every few days in the Sumy region like it's happening right now, but it turns out to be all of a sudden there's a break somewhere in the dam and the Russians start moving fast and they're going down there. What you can certainly imagine that those who are already like Mark Rutte here will be picking that up as a big red flag and saying, oh my God, this is what we've been telling you about. Russia's coming for us next. We have to increase even more defense spending. So instead of, not throwing more good money after bad, we need to put more money to make sure that doesn't happen to us. How would that play out?
Well, I think, and I've said this before, I think that we obviously don't think Russia's coming for us, because if we did, we'd be mobilizing now. We would be standing up the local forces around some of our key infrastructure and things like that. We would be actually turning car making industries into tank making industries and so on. We're not doing that. And we're talking about getting to, in this country, we're talking about getting 2.5%, I think, 3% by the end of the parliament, 3% by the end of the next parliament. That's 10 years or 8 years. So we're obviously don't think Putin's coming for us because we're not mobilizing. And again, I think that as the facts start to emerge, that Ukraine will lose, but that there's no sense that, I'm sure that there'll be lots of people will start to question the whole motivation of the war and start to explore the war, the history of it and the genesis of it in a much more nuanced way, especially as they see their own budget starting to be slashed. And money to go on top of money that's already gone. I suspect that actually the truth will start to emerge. And as it starts to emerge, then I suspect that political parties on whichever are the other side of the ruling parties will start to question it. And as that happens, it'll put governments in the Western Europe in a much more difficult position. So much so that they're going to have to sort of back off. But it's going to be, if it's an ugly end to the conflict for Ukraine, it's going to be an ugly end as well in Western European capitals.
Well, that moment hasn't arrived yet, and so the fiction continues on. Mark Rutte there mentioned General Breuer from the German defense chief, and I want to play something he said here, but I want to prep that by telling you about something that the U.S. another retired general who should be in that platoon you mentioned, saying that he was mocking Russia because after 39 months, and he was literally laughing on camera just a few days ago, saying that it's been 39 months and they still haven't even taken all of the Donbass, and so ha, those poor Russians. And yet at the same time, here is the German defense chief sounding a big red flag.
How serious is the threat facing NATO right now from the east, from Russia?
I think it's a very serious threat. I've never seen a situation like this in my 40 years of service. It's really coming to a point where I must say we have to be prepared, and we have to be prepared to be ready to, of course, being able to defend ourselves, but at the same time to do deterrence, just to show Russia that it's not easy to have an attack against NATO territory. So we must be able to fight tonight. And for this fight tonight, we are, of course, we are ready because we are soldiers, we are trained, we are educated, and we have weapons. So therefore, we can take this fight tonight.
Okay, so first of all, a little personal context here. When I was in the U.S. Army, I served a total of 6 years in Germany as part of the U.S. Armed Forces, Germany, Europe, etc. And for him to say, and he doesn't look much younger than I am, that this is the worst time in his whole life that he can see that the threat coming from Russia. I served on the front lines while there was still a DDR, East Germany. And to patrol that border when there was about 50,000 tanks on the Warsaw Pact side, etc. And I'm thinking that it's going to be a pretty hard sell to tell me that the threat from Russia today with half of Warsaw actually on our side already is worse than that, I think he's barking up the wrong tree. But I specifically want to ask you his contention that, okay, we're ready to fight tonight. We can do that. But we just got to be better ready to fight later on. Are they ready to fight tonight?
No, no. I think I've mentioned it before. What we've done steadily over the last 20 years since the end of the Cold War is to actually bring down our armed forces, and we've invested less in them. Again, I just use Britain as an example of that because that's what I know best. But our GDP spending at the end of the Cold War was 6%. We're now down to 2.5%. The anti-submarine forces that I was part of at the world, we've now got a third of those forces. So, and it's the same all over the place. We had a British army of over 100,000. I'm sure it would have been the same for the Germans. So no, we're not ready, and it's probably in three respects. Firstly, we're not ready in terms of the mass or the capability. Secondly, we're not ready in terms of the industrial capabilities to support that. I mean, different discussions about how much ammunition we have, but a lot of it's already been expended in Ukraine. And where we know that Russia's outproducing us at the rate of 4-1. And the third is tactically, Danny, because we know how different the war's become and how working with drones. And there will be, of course, there will be Western, that some people might call them mercenaries, we might call them other things actually, but the Western troops actually in the Ukrainian battlefield. And they're about the only people who will have experienced this. So the idea that we're ready, nothing could be further from the truth. Again, my article on NATO pertains. We will not be ready for at least another 5 years and probably another 10 years, as Doug says.
Well, and in fact, in that continue on with that same interview with the German general there, he talks about the Russian capacities, and so I want you to comment on that in a second. But I also want you to pay attention here to one of his premises here, that basically Russia is signaling their intent to attack NATO.
What we see at the moment is that Russia is building up their forces to an enormous extent. We see that they're producing approximately 1,500 main battle tanks every year. And out of this main battle tanks, it's not every single tank is going to Ukraine, but it's also going in stocks and into new military structures, always facing the West. At the same time, there's a production of 4 million rounds of artillery ammunition, so 155 millimeters. And it's also not going into the war in Ukraine. So what we see is quite a huge build-up. And what we assess, and when I'm talking to all the analysts, it's clear that there's an intention. And Putin has stated it several times now, and not only Putin, but the entire administration in there. There's an intent, and there's a buildup of the stocks. And this culminates, I would say, and this is what the analysts are assessing, in 2029. So we have to be ready by 2029.
Okay, first of all, it's Russians don't make 155 millimeter. That's what we use. It's 152, which I thought was an odd mistake for him to make. But that's actually just a minor issue. But what do you make of this bigger claim that Russia has clearly signaled its intent that it wants to come fight Russia, and all this buildup he's talking about, and it is there? What do you say about that?
I'd say he's falling into the trap that so many Western generals and diplomats and admirals do, which is that they've made a guess on what they think Russia's objectives are and what they think Russia's strategy are, and then they're actually producing all their analysis based on that guess. They don't know. I don't know. But what I do know is that I don't think there is a single thing that Putin has said which confirms anything that he said. And indeed, everything that he and Lavrov have said is the reverse. What Lavrov and Putin have said is they want to remove the fundamental causes of the war. And another thing that I repeat, but why would the Russians want to take over Western Europe?
Yeah.
What is there here that they want? We've got highly indebted societies. We've got problems with a number of internal problems. I mean, frankly, in their situation, it's the last thing that I want. What I would probably want is a wall across. I'm being lighthearted now, but a wall from north to south across the border, to make sure that I wasn't infected by all the problems that seem to have infected Europe. I mean, more seriously, those two fundamentals of industrial capacity and energy. Yeah, Russia has more than it needs in both, and indeed it's developing a much stronger relationship with China now, thanks to us, and so it doesn't need us economically. And I can think of no reason why Russia would want to take over Europe, unless, of course, we asked it to come and help sort out some of the problems that we've created for ourselves.
So let's look at this issue of buildup. I was on an American broadcast about a month ago, when there was a lot of information that the Russians had been building up military bases opposite of it was either Norway or Lithuania. I can't recall which, but right off the top. But they showed these satellite imagery of 6 months ago, and then there's all these new facilities going up. And the fear was that, yes, look, this is exactly what they did when they attacked into Ukraine. They started off about 6 to 9 months ahead of time with this big buildup around the border, and then they came in there. So doesn't this prove that the Russians are just that they're aggressive, and that they actually are planning to come into NATO? Because that's how it was being pilled everywhere else. Well, what I tried to explain was that nothing happens in a vacuum. And you also had, and we've shown this here, Chancellor Merz went to Lithuania to christen this new, for the first time since World War II, the deployment of German troops on another country's soil, specifically arrayed against Russia. And then you have all these other countries. They keep talking about how they're getting ready to go to war against Russia. There's the Baltic, no, sorry, not the Baltic. Yeah, the Nordic nations actually are warning their people, so to the extent of, you need to start stockpiling information because there could be a war with Russia. Well, if you hear all of that stuff from the Russian side, and you see the physical deployment of German troops closer to your border, I mean, you're not going to sit there passively. So the real question is the whole tit for tat thing, where the sides keep going up, and I respond to you, you respond to me. Well, now I'm going to respond bigger. We'll build up. Is there a way to find out, say, who has actually started this build up escalation ladder here, and what do we do to get off of it?
I mean, I think the first thing, Danny, is that we've seen no sign of it, but we need some proper analysis of how we got here. It feels to me as if in the West, if the West were doctors, if you came into the doctor surgery, one of the Western leaders, or one military or political, they'd take one look at you and say, "I know what you need, and this is the treatment. Now get out of the surgery because I've got better things to do." Whereas most doctors, with any common sense, would say, "Let's do some diagnosis. What happened? How did this work out? Why are we in the situation we are?" And the truth is that the diagnosis takes you all the way back, as I've said, to the end of the Cold War. And when we talk about increasing forces, was it not the case, I think, that there were between 2014 and 2022, there were the creation of 20, I think, is the number of CIA bases in Ukraine. What were they for? And again, I was shocked, but interested in Larry Johnson's analysis to show that between 2014, I think I can't remember what the exact figure was at the start, but at the end we were up to about 800,000 people in potential uniform in Ukraine. And you've got to, in the Russian situation, you've got to look at that and think, what's that for? Especially when you've had the RAND Institute and others talking about how to start to undermine Russia. I said in a very early article, I think it was about September of 2022, that one of my speculations was that I wondered if one of the reasons why the Russians had actually gone into Ukraine was because the general staff, or the Russian general staff, had said this is getting worse, and if we don't do this now, then it's going to be an even more difficult ladder for us to climb. I think it probably wasn't. I think Jack Bode's analysis is probably much better. It was to do with the fact that the peoples in the Donbass were being attacked by Ukrainian nationalists, and of course the drive towards, after the Maidan Revolution, towards taking Ukraine into NATO was really concerning Russia. I said at the time that what it looked like, the build-up of the forces looked like that we were taking Ukraine into NATO, but it was just de facto as opposed to de jure. So the idea that actually history started on the 22nd or the 22nd of February 2022, it's well, I'm glad that if he was a doctor, that particular general, he's not my doctor. The last thing I want is somebody who can't be bothered to do any diagnosis, strategic diagnosis whatsoever.
And I've shown about NATO in general, about the German general talking about Germany, the Nordic countries. Even in the UK, you also have some issues about also starting to prepper. So here is just, I guess, a couple of days ago, your prime minister talking about an expansion of the UK military.
We are moving to warfighting readiness as the central purpose of our armed forces. When we are being directly threatened by states with advanced military forces, the most effective way to deter them is to be ready. And frankly, to show them that we're ready. To deliver peace through strength, we'll build a fighting force that is more integrated, more ready, more lethal than ever.
I know you have to be careful how you answer some questions regarding the UK, but the one thing I'm puzzled by is, because I've heard it by many statesmen and other commentators on British media, that there is a direct threat against the UK that we have to have a response to. And obviously they're only talking about Russia, but I've not seen any evidence of Russia having a direct military conventional threat against the UK. So I wonder if you can explain a little bit about what's behind Keir Starmer's comments here.
I was actually in the department in MOD, we would call the Department of Policy Planning, who actually wrote defence reviews, and we actually wrote one in 2003, Danny, after the 9/11 and how that sort of played out. So I've got some insights into this. But I think it's in terms of the direct.
Danny, if I can, I need to interject here. We have some breaking news regarding Trump. If you want to just see on the screen, he just put up a Truth Social about how he's been speaking with Putin. So maybe we can just read this to our audience.
Okay, yeah, sure. See, he says, I just finished speaking by telephone with President Putin. That's a big deal. The call lasted approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes. We discussed the attack on Russia's docked airplanes by Ukraine and also various attacks that have been taking place by both sides. It is good conversation, but not a conversation that will lead to immediate peace. President Putin did say very strongly that he will have to respond to the recent attacks on the airfield. We also discussed Iran and the fact that time is running out on Iran's decision pertaining nuclear weapons, which must be made quickly. I stated to President Putin that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, and on this, I believe we are in agreement. President Putin suggested that he will be participating in the discussion with Iran, that he could perhaps helpful in getting this through to rapid conclusion. It is my opinion that Iran has been slow walking their documents, all that. Well, okay, the key part there is that Putin told Trump that there will be a response, that he has to respond. And you don't see anything in there anyway about Trump saying, no, don't do it, or that's a bad idea. It sounds to me like he just said, get ready because something's coming. I mean, what do you make of that?
What I guess in this is that Trump didn't know that the attacks were going to happen, because I suspect that if he had known, he would have felt very uncomfortable about it. The question, therefore, is who did know. There's talk of Pete Hegseth actually watching the attacks in live stream, but there again, I can remember in 2002 watching live stream attacks as 9/11 happened and seeing the second. It was on CNN and seeing the second airliner hit the second of the Twin Towers. So the question then is, who else was involved? Because if CIA wasn't involved and it was purely Ukraine, then of course you would expect the responses against Ukraine. If there was evidence that there was somebody else involved, such as MI6, then I'd be pretty nervous in this country that one of those responses could be against this country. I think we said this when Storm Shadows were fired, and I sort of mentioned that it could also be against the French as well. I would, if somebody asked me to guess, I would say that Putin probably wouldn't, because actually he's got the he's got the hand. He's got a very strong hand. He's dominating on the battlefield and moving towards the objectives that I think he wants. But I think it was also interesting because Trump also said something else in there, which he said that there would be no immediate peace. Now that tells me that Trump started to accept that, and to accept that there won't be an immediate peace, and therefore the fact that we can't get to a 30-day ceasefire, that's probably out of the window, which is a good thing, because it was never going to be a runner with the Russians anyway. So that to me feels to me quite sort of pragmatic about Trump, and the fact that he's saying that is a good thing. So
what is your guess, by the way, about the range of possibilities? What could Putin do? Because if since strategic assets were hit by the Ukraine side, one would think, because history says that Russia is very keen on the whole tit for tat. You do this to me, I do the same to you, etc. What might Russia do that would be of strategic importance to Ukraine that they haven't done already?
Very good question. I think it's a much more intense attacks across the infrastructure, and I think they will always be careful about civilian casualties, because they seem to be extremely careful about civilian casualties so far. But actually going across the Ukrainian infrastructure, just about anything that had any military capacity, essentially taking it out. And of course, I don't know how many Rezhnev missiles they have, and none of us know. But again, with the different forms of not only Rezhnev, but other hypersonic missiles, they have the capacity to pretty much destroy anything they want. A lot would depend, I suspect, on the intelligence. But if they've got good intelligence, then they know they've got parts of the military architecture, and of course parts of the industrial architecture, then I could imagine they'll move to a much more aggressive state against that. And then the open question is whether they respond to others who they think might have been involved in those attacks. I mean, we often hear people in the West say, well, of course, it's easy for Russia because we're not allowed to. Ukraine has until now had its hands tied behind its back about attacking the Russian sort of rear areas, what you and I would call sort of, quite a long way away. But of course, it's actually the reverse. The reverse of the case, because Russian rear areas have been attacked, but Ukraine's rear areas haven't, because of course Ukraine's rear areas are in Eastern and Western Europe. They're anywhere but in Ukraine, because actually the deep industrial capacity and the deep logistics capacity is outside the Ukraine theatre. But it's not impossible that the Russians might want to actually make a statement and attack one or more of those facilities. I mean, I did wonder, for example, if you're having got Zelensky, you might want to I think this probably isn't, but it gives you an illustration. You might want to have a look at Ramstein and say, okay, perhaps we should do something about Ramstein. Or
it was the epicenter since the beginning of the war.
Yeah. I mean, Russia's had attacks on Moscow, and it goes on and on and on. So I wouldn't rule. I would rule some things out, but I think the most likely thing would be, if they were to attack outside the campaign area, would be an attack which is a warning. It's a warning to the West, and saying this to the West, and this is what we can do, and we can do more of it. But I also hope, Tony, that they'll pick up the phone, and that the Russian chief of the General Staff will pick up the phone to his opposite numbers in France, Germany, and Britain, and say, this is on the table, and if anything else like this happens again, we will take action against you. And then, of course, the interesting question then is who in NATO is going to come in behind them? Because if I was in America, I wouldn't.
And certainly I would advocate strongly against that as well. Yeah. But this is what I have been worried about from the outset of this war, is the possibility of an expansion outside of Ukraine, which could draw us into a war. Could actually draw us into a war between NATO or even independent European states and Russia, which, has way too high of a specter of possibly going nuclear after that. And it looked to me like we were kind of on the downward trend here. But now then, with this latest escalation by the Ukraine side into strategic nuclear capable bombers deep inside of Russia, now all of a sudden that's coming back up. And that is something we need to be carefully paying attention to, because everyone would lose if this war expands between Russia and anybody else outside of Ukraine. And we should all be sober-minded on making sure we tamp this down right now.
Yeah, I could not agree more, Danny. I sometimes feel that we're sort of, I don't know whether you have the same feeling. I sometimes feel that I'm living in a rogue state with suicidal tendencies. And it's sort
Unfortunately,
of,
I do recognize that feeling.
and it's not the people. This is something the people that want, but there are those within the elites who seem to be incapable of strategic analysis and strategic thinking, and have very poor military and strategic judgment. And that's terrible in a situation like this, where we should be working to try and get the war to a close, to stop the losses, particularly of Ukrainians on the battlefield, but also of Russians, but also to reduce the risk that you just say of nuclear escalation. It was the Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman who said,
I read that book,
explained how this could so easily happen. So this is a time
Indeed.
for the same sort of patience and judgment that Putin has said to be shown in the Western leaders.
Yeah. And now then, if Putin makes good on that threat, and I've rarely seen him bluff about something like this that he's telling, I think that something could be imminent. And man, how these lack of strategic thinking people and leaders you just mentioned, how they'll respond to that is what scares me. But we are where we are, and we have to deal with what's out there, and we'll have to hope that somehow sanity can come in, or at least enough voices like yours can carry the day when it comes down to it. But we'll leave it there for the moment.
Yeah.
And we'll see.
Thanks again, Danny. I was just going to say as well, I love the comments that we get afterwards. They're all positive, but actually I'd say to those people who are listening, don't hesitate to push this message across Europe, because we're trying to actually fight a little bit for truth and for some realism here, realpolitik, as opposed to this political narrative, which is taking us in a terribly dangerous and destructive way. So, but thanks for all you do, Danny.
It is. Yeah. And I echo that too, to all of our viewers, everybody who's watching this video, whether live or in the video that's posted later on. Make your voice heard by whatever means, whether that's in Telegram, X, anything else, any kind of social media you got. Spread the word out there. Let's don't go down this catastrophic road here. It's time to end the insanity and bring this back to a situation of at least stability. We'll worry about peace later. Let's get stability first so that we don't get escalation, because we will all lose if that happens, I promise you. Thank you very much. And just to let you know, now then, we had this show here planned at 2 o'clock today with Professor John Mearsheimer, that Russia has been saying already there's not going to be any compromises. Well, you can imagine he's got more to say now based on this breaking news. Do not miss this show, folks. 2 o'clock today, and then later on. But Trump also mentioned in that same Truth Social media issue about Iran. Iran's been playing hardball too, and that will feature prominently this afternoon. So you're not going to want to miss these two shows, folks. These are going to be blockbusters. Thank you very much, and we will look forward to seeing you later this afternoon on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.